Now, Mike Lee is a United States Senator. He is the senior senator representing the state of Utah as a Republican. It's an office he's held since 2011. And as part of his position on the Senate Judiciary Committee, as well as with his substantial background in constitutional law, including clerking for the U.S. Supreme Court, Senator Lee has long been a vocal proponent of individual privacy and an opponent of unlimited domestic government spying, particularly without warrants, as 702 permit. So he sounded the alarm. He was one of the people to sound the alarm today about just how dangerous this new House intelligence legislation would be if it were passed, and we are delighted to welcome him to the program to talk to us about all of this tonight. We have him by audio only, but you'll be able to hear him perfectly. Senator, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, thank you, Glenn. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, good to have you. So I had on my program last week Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky, who, like you, is an opponent of renewing these authorities without reforms. And he was warning, he said, look, there's a lot of bipartisan support for reforms on the House Judiciary Committee. The problem is the House Intelligence Committee seems to be working very hard to extend it without reforms. And it turns out their bill would do something far worse than that, far worse than simply extending it. You sounded the alarm. What is it about this bill that you find so problematic?
Okay, so the House Intelligence Committee bill, the HIPSY, as we call that committee, is doubly bad. Number one, it extends out the authorization period for FISA 702 by 9 years. To my knowledge, we've never had an authorization for FISA that long. Number two, it does so without any generally applicable warrant requirement. It purports to have a warrant requirement for a narrow subset of backdoor searches on American citizens, but they've written it in such a way that it would have practically zero effect. It wouldn't really have any practical effect because they can always get around this very narrow type of search where it's focused exclusively on evidence of a crime with nothing having to do with an actual national security investigation. But it's so much worse than that. The third big problem with the HIPSY bill, and this is the granddaddy of them all, is found in Section 504 of the HIPSY bill. In Section 504, this would vastly magnify the domestic surveillance capability and the ability of our intelligence gathering agencies to collect warrantless surveillance on American citizens without probable cause in the United States by expanding the reach of 702 into things like public Wi-Fi's at hotels, restaurants, coffee shops, bookstores, anything like that. All of a sudden, the intelligence gathering agencies could go to those entities that offer public Wi-Fi service, demand without a warrant all the data that crossed through those public Wi-Fi stations. And they could do that without ever going to court, without ever having to demonstrate probable cause or otherwise going through the steps of acquiring a warrant. This is bad. They're claiming that they're fixing the problem, and they're actually making the problem worse. And this is appalling. This is why this bill is something I've been describing as a Trojan horse, appropriately so, and it needs to be dismissed as such.
Senator, one of the experiences that I've had as a journalist most frustrating is I've been following this program since it was first revealed in 2005, this warrantless eavesdropping program. And the history of it is always the same. You have years of reports, and I don't mean media reports, but inside the government, inspectors general and the like, proving abuse of these spying powers, major abuse. And then every year when the FBI comes, or the U.S. government, the executive branch comes to Congress and says, we need a renewal of it immediately, no reforms, they're asked, well, you keep abusing the law. Why would it be different? And every time they say, oh, no, don't worry. We instituted internal reforms that will prevent any abuses this time. And then the cycle repeats itself. We showed your exchange, part of it, with FBI Director Christopher Wray. But what are some of the abuses, A, that you've seen recently, and then B, that you are concerned about if the law in that form gets enacted?
Okay, so some of the abuses that we know happened that have been verified include doing backdoor searches on at least one member of the United States Senate, at least one member of the U.S. House of Representatives, backdoor searches also just to the tune of hundreds of thousands, some have said we're now up to millions of documented warrantless backdoor searches on American citizens. And I assume you know what I mean when I refer to that. A backdoor search on the 702 database is directed at communication, electronic communications stored by NSA, collected under 702, ostensibly under the auspices of a foreign intelligence surveillance investigation. But when they've got the substantive contents of what an American said in those conversations, if they go in and search specifically for what the American said, using that American's phone number or email address or something like that, that ought to require a warrant. Now, under their procedures, they're not supposed to be able to do that willy-nilly, just for kicks and giggles, and yet they do. And they have done it millions and millions of times. As you correctly pointed out, I'm glad you showed some of the exchange I had with Christopher Wray. When I cross-examined him on that last week, it did not go particularly well for him, in part because he had the audacity to make the same darn argument these guys have been making to me for 13 years, which is to say we've got internal procedures that will make sure that those are not misused. And yet every year they say the same thing, and every year more of these illegal searches happen. And in fact, I caught him pointing out some of the examples that he pointed to for some of these illegal searches. He said these all happened before we adopted these procedures. We went in and looked those up after the hearing, and we concluded that there were several instances that he pointed to that actually had happened after his most recent policies. As far as the hypothetical ones, the ones that we can't yet prove, but that I fear either are occurring regularly or might well happen in the future, or some combination of those two things, involve what we might call reverse targeting. You can't target an American citizen to be the target under FISA 702. That has to be a foreign national operating on foreign soil. But you can incidentally collect communications with the foreign national who is on foreign soil of an American citizen on American soil. And so it's entirely possible what they could be doing, or what they could do in the future, is reverse target by saying, oh, look, we know that Glenn talks to foreign nationals A, B, C, and D. Let's open up a FISA 702 set of searches, an investigation under FISA 702 on individuals A, B, C, and D, knowing that Glenn talks to them. On that basis, they pull in any conversations you may have with those foreign nationals, and then they can go back in and do a backdoor search of your communications with them, when that may have been their intent all along, is to get your communications without a warrant.
Yeah, exactly. This was, of course, something that was talked about a lot when it was first enacted in 2008. And they said, no, don't worry, there's provisions in there that prevent us from doing this. And yet they've gotten caught doing it so many times. And the question of intent, what are they really looking for? The people with whom I'm speaking and they just happen to be finding mine all the time, or they're really just looking through mine in a backdoor kind of way, is almost impossible to prove. But what we know is they end up spying on Americans and reading our communications with no warrants of any kind. Now, let me ask you about the politics of this. I remember right when we did the Snowden reporting, there was a lot of momentum for bipartisan reform. It was sponsored by Justin Amash and John Conyers in the House. It picked up a lot of support quickly. And at the last second, President Obama got Nancy Pelosi to whip just enough Democratic votes to sabotage reform. And there's an article in Foreign Policy, the headline of which is How Nancy Pelosi Saved the NSA. There's always been this bipartisan component, this willingness on a bipartisan basis to extend these powers, with the kind of increased skepticism of the U.S. security state, the FBI, the CIA, and the like, on the part of large parts of the Republican Party and the American right after they saw what they were willing to do in our elections. Is there a plausible chance this time that there can be a bipartisan coalition to block renewal without real reforms?
Yeah, look, I think there is a plausible chance here that we could get something actually done because of the fact that they're running out of excuses. All of their arguments that they've used in the past have turned out to be red herrings. And so I think we could get it done this time. Let me tell you what worries me most about what could interfere with that this time around. Number one, the fact that they've put in a temporary extension into the National Defense Authorization Act that would extend this thing to, I think, April 19th of 2024 is troubling. We need to stop that. We need to push back on that in part because there is a certification that's done by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that I'm told once it's put in place, it can run for 365 continuous days, even if FISA expires during that time period. That suggests that this extension, taking this thing to April 19th, 2024, I believe, could, in practical effect, end up being an extension until April 19th of 2025. We've got to stop that from happening and get rid of that language. And if we can get that out, replace it at a bare minimum if we want a short-term extension so that we can iron out exactly what the details ought to look like. I mean, my first choice would be to just pass the bill that came out of the House Judiciary Committee bill. If we can't get that done before we have to leave for Christmas, we could consider extending it, but only with the additional caveat not found in the current extension that would say that any subsequent certification by the FISC may not be operative past the expiration date of FISA 702. I think that would make a difference.
Last question that I have for you, and I know this is something you've encountered a lot as a civil libertarian, somebody who defends individual privacy rights and the like. A lot of Americans, ordinary Americans, think, you know what, this doesn't really have much to do with me, even if they're kind of stepping over lines. I think they're looking for terrorists and criminals, not necessarily for me. I don't really do anything that would provoke their interest. Why should ordinary Americans care if the government has safeguards on the way they can spy on American citizens?
Well, first of all, you should worry about it for the same reason that you worry about people going hungry, even if those people are not likely to be you. You should worry about it for the simple reason that whenever government overacts, it does so at the expense of individual liberty. And when it does so at the expense of individual liberty, even if you think it's not likely to be your individual liberty compromised by it, that doesn't mean that it won't be you the next time. Doesn't mean that in a few short days, weeks, months, years, or decades, that somebody in the government might want to take advantage of you for whatever reason. And we've seen manipulation of these things in all kinds of strange circumstances, many of which are petty. We caught a couple of guys doing a search because one of them owned a rental property, and they were doing a backdoor search under 702 because they wanted to check out a prospective tenant. On another occasion, there was a guy who thought that his father might be having an affair, cheating on his mom, and so he did a backdoor search under 702 on his dad. You never know exactly who you know, who might, unbeknownst to you, have access to these databases. You never know when somebody you currently know that doesn't now work there might have access to it. You never know when you might be at the wrong end of some public or private dispute that might result in this. Any way you look at it, when you start to allow the government to go after someone, to search and seize the information or objects from an American citizen without a warrant, it's eventually coming to you. And if not to you today, to at least someone you know and care about today, and you eventually. It's not worth gambling over this. We don't play dice with our Fourth Amendment rights. Nations that have departed from protections like these, because these warrant requirements are something that in one way or another are supposed to be held in common by everyone whose legal structure traces back to the English common law. They should all have this in one form or another. Nations that depart from them have very, very bad consequences for everyone.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.